Okay, hello. This is our first lecture of Unit 2, which is about 12-tone serialism. Of course, as I pointed out, we reversed the order of Units 2 and 3. I think that works out better. Um, so this is a unit, an interesting unit that's devoted to a single method. It's the only compositional method that we will study. Even tonality really isn't a method, but the 12 tone method, what Schoenberg called the method of composing 12 tones that are only related to one another, is the one method we have. So it's kind of fun. And it's had a lot of impact, a lot of influence. We'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do any of this, I have this YouTube video. I've included a link if you look down below this video and click on the this Glenn Gould Schoenberg Suite for Piano Introduction and watch it. So I'll give you a moment to pause this and then click on that and then come back to this after you're done. It's about it's almost 9 minutes, but I'll keep my thing short. Okay, go ahead and do that. Pause. Okay, we're back. Now, I mentioned that we're going to talk broadly about the 12 tone method and we're going to review the readings. I'll just say a few quick things. I mentioned that Schoenberg called it the method of composing with 12 tones that are only related to one another, that it is a method, and it's fairly straightforward. We'll look at it broadly in this lecture, and then in the next lecture we'll get a little bit more technical. But I think you'll find it's it's a little bit of math, but the kind of math that you would learn in elementary school. Really, it's counting and etc. And I mentioned that this is a method, but it's been quite influential. First of all, during the 20th century, and of course we divide the 20th century pre-World War II and post-World War II. Pre-World War II, Schoenberg, of course, had his two students that we've already talked about when we talked about free atonality, Webern and Berg, who both took up this method that Schoenberg essentially brought into being, as Glenn Gould pointed out in this suite in 1923, the first piece all of whose movements were in this 12-tone method. And Webern and Berg enthusiastically took up this method, and a few other composers in Europe. Then after World War II, an interesting thing happened. 12-tone serialism was taken up by many American composers, students of Milton Babbitt's and others. And 12-tone serialism became quite ascendant among American university composers. And the university composers, that's a whole phenomenon. The infrastructure of classical music at least partially shifts to universities, which expanded greatly because of the GI Bill, because of all the soldiers coming back, sailors and airmen coming back from Europe and the campaign with the Japanese. And so universities were expanded quickly to accommodate these men and some women. And music departments were expanded. The standards of granting tenure were sort of adopted from the sciences and spread out into the humanities and fine arts. We get a situation in the United States where music in Europe certainly was taught in conservatories, which were not part of universities. But in this country, in the United States, there are some conservatories, but to a large extent, music is taught in universities like our own. And so we get this phenomenon of people like yours truly who are tasked principally with teaching the technical parts of music, music theory, and ear training, really kind of the things that you come to a conservatory or university to study that you can't necessarily study in high school. And most of us tend to be composers. And uh, composers, so these university composers are taught theory, this influx of professors in the 1950s and 60s um, became interested in 12 tone serialism, I think partially because it was a very learned kind of composing. It was something that you could quantify to a certain extent. You could do research in. So it was like an art form that also had aspects of research, so that again, this influx of sort of an alien discipline into the university that was dominated by scientists could sort of demonstrate that they were doing work that was both artistic and sort of quasi scientific. I don't know. We might argue how scientific this is, but so in the United States, then in Europe, there was a whole group of students that studied at the Darmstadt school. We talked about that already, I think, in regards to Messiaen, who the Darmstadt summer school was set up by the United States as part of the Marshall Plan, and there's a whole bunch of stuff we could talk about regarding that. But the first teacher of composition, this was in the late 40s, was Olivier Messiaen, who we've looked at already, and his students included Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Pierre Boulez especially, but lots of others, Xenakis, Luigi Nono, Ligeti. Anyway, we could list a whole bunch, but especially in regards to 12-tone serialism, we have this group of European serialists, Stockhausen and Boulez especially, but also Nono would be an important person to mention, who embraced serialism that, Messiaen introduced them to the music of Webern, and they are much more interested in Webern's music than in Schoenberg's music. There's another huge topic that we may get to, but so for a few years, what we would call the European avant-garde and the American academic composers, university composers, were very enamored with serialism. But the interesting thing is, it didn't last super long. But what did last long is this idea of having sort of a pre-compositional method or design uh, before composing a piece of music. You had to come up with something like serialism, maybe invent your own method or adapt serialism, or just this is how I was taught with some of my teachers, is that you're not a composer if you don't come up with sort of a grammar or some kind of pre-compositional plan or design or pre-compositional set of rules. I don't know. It could take many forms. This comes from this 12-tone method. That's the big impact, I would think. And also this idea of automating part of the compositional process really comes from serialism, 12-tone serialism, the 12-tone method, whatever you want to call it. This idea that music making should be researched in some way, not um, in addition to or instead of even um, a composer receiving inspiration or um, creating something of beauty or of impact. Serialism brought in this idea of, well, maybe music is more kind of discovery. A composer writes something down without exactly knowing what the impact will be, because part of the process is a gamble. You have a pre-compositional procedure that you don't exactly know how it will play out. Now Schoenberg might disagree with that, but I think that's part of it, and that's experimental music, which departs radically from serialism. I think really comes out of this point of view that music can be experimental, and it comes from the ascendancy of the sciences in university composition, and also that composers of the Darmstadt generation were enamored with science in general, certainly as a way of transcending the fascistic recent past, which one could view as a sort of, I don't know how to describe it, a sort of perverted humanism or romanticism. Well, this sort of objective scientific approach to things could be a way to get past that. Well, anyway, but we're going back again to the early 1920s, although Schoenberg wrote this article in 1941, of course, and we'll look a little bit at this. Now, Schoenberg, of course, in the manner of many treatises on music, starts off with an appeal to scripture, an appeal to religion, and he talks about composer as a creator similar to God. I think that Schoenberg liked to compare himself to God somewhat. I think he had in order to do what he did, you had to have a pretty big ego, I think, maybe mostly in good ways. He told a story once about when he was inducted into the German army, drafted in World War I, and they were at basic training, and there was the first roll call, and his drill sergeant said, "Oh, Arnold Schoenberg, aren't you the one that composes that awful music, hideous music?" And he said, Schoenberg said, well, someone had to do it. So he really believed that he was called. He was somewhat like a prophet, and that he was sent here to do this thing and to advance German music and the Germanic spirit. I don't think it, of course, everything sort of having to do with Germanicness previous to World War II feels a little bit like, proto-Nazism. I don't think that's where Schoenberg, who was Jewish, was coming from, but he did believe in the ascendancy of the Austro-German tradition in classical music, which still kind of holds sway, I would say. Anyway, okay, so he says a creator has a vision of something which has not existed before this vision. Now, of course, this is reminiscent of the ex nihilo version of creation. Mormonism, of course, proposes the idea of organizing materials that already exist. But his point of view is the bringing something out of nothing. But anyway, divine model, inspiration and perfection, wish and fulfillment, will and accomplishment. These are his view of creation. Now, I think what you're seeing here is Schoenberg spent a lot of time trying to justify, again, what he did, which was very controversial at the time. So he's trying to say, hey, look, I'm a creator. I have inspiration. I'm not a robotic composer. I'm not, composing like a mathematician or whatever. I mean, what's wrong with mathematicians, I would ask. But anyway, okay, so then he says, it's one thing to envision in a creative instant of inspiration, and it is another thing to materialize one's vision by painstakingly connecting details until they fuse into a kind of organism. That's really important. I may have talked about this before, but certainly the Austro-German tradition is that works of art are organisms themselves. And we could trace this back to a number of philosophical places. We don't have time for that right now, but the organic model of works of art. And certainly, if we look at the great model for musical structure that was ascendant at this time, Beethoven's large instrumental works, those definitely have are, governed by this organic model. And we talked about the Hegelian dialectic, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, basically taking two opposite things, combining them together and making a new thing, which is also sexual reproduction, bringing a sperm and an egg together to create a living new organism that has aspects of the two gametes in them. Anyway, and what he's saying is it's too bad humans, we poor human beings, we have to go through this painstakingly connecting the details, whereas God supposedly didn't have to do that. Of course, Mormons would disagree with that, I think, probably. Anyway, and then he talks about this idea of comprehensibility is governs form. So he's saying, okay, you have this idea and you have to put it in a form so that you can communicate or convey it to others. And the creator's idea. So Schoenberg really, this idea of an idea is a big deal for Schoenberg. Now, of course, if we were to look at a composer like Debussy, I don't know that ideas are the main event. But for Schoenberg, music is expressive. It's a kind of discourse. And this is definitely, I think, proceeding from, a very strong Judeo-Christian point of view that a lot of our activity is about receiving messages, receiving communication from the beyond, and applying that communication. And so that music and other art forms are a form of this communication, a form of prophecy, I guess you could say. So he's going to look at this idea of an idea rather than something, a beauty for its own sake. He's basically saying that comprehensibility, all of the aspects, all of the parameters of music, orchestration, harmony, form, etc., are in the service of expression, of communication, of discourse. And then he says, for composing thus, he says, 12-tone method, it may seem to increase the listener's difficulties, but then it compensates for this deficiency by penalizing the composer. I don't know how that compensates. That's proposing, the listener is being punished by having to listen to difficult, dissonant music, but then that's okay because the composer suffers even more. That's kind of a funny idea. So this starts to say, let's look at it a little bit more of this. Clockwise. Okay, here we go. Okay, so he goes through this historic sketch of European classical music. We talked about this, the emancipation of the dissonance, and how gradually, previously dissonant intervals start to become accepted as consonances. And then I think dissonance disappears. It's emancipated. So I suppose one might think of the idea that I don't know, different intervals just have their own relationships, their own sound, rather than being part of a binary uh, discursive or rhetorical function. Dissonance resolving to consonance. He's saying, well, yeah, different intervals, the minor second, the perfect fifth, perfect fourth, major second, they all have their own sound and they're all useful in different ways, but they're no longer part of this. Okay, this one has to resolve to that one. Okay, and then he's also saying, treat dissonance. Okay, the term emancipation of the dissonance refers to its comprehensibility, which is considered, again, comprehensibility. That's also reinforcing this idea that Schoenberg views music as a form of communication, okay, which is considered equivalent to the consonance's comprehensibility. A style based on this premise treats dissonances like consonances and renounces atonal center. Okay, and we've already encountered that. And then he talks about how, we talked about this before, composing free atonal music. It was really hard and he could only write short pieces. And then he had to counterbalance extreme emotionality with extraordinary shortness. So short movements, and we noticed that from the pieces we studied in the first unit. And then he says, formerly the harmony served not only as a source of beauty, but more important, here again, more important, as a means of distinguishing the features of the form. So again, beauty is less important to Schoenberg than kind of communication. A little later, I discovered how to construct large forms by following a text or a poem. I think he's referring directly to Piero Lunaire, but this is a piece that has 36 movements, so it's still short. Okay, now, he talks a little bit. There's some stuff here that's very interesting, good, blah, blah, blah. We'll skip over this. After many unsuccessful attempts during a period of approximately 12 years, you remember that Glenn Gould talked about this fallow period, I laid the foundations for a new procedure in musical construction which seemed fitted to replace those structural differentiations provided formerly by tonal harmonies. So he's saying, okay, harmony mainly, and again, we're looking at, especially in the music of Beethoven and Wagner, where modulations or key areas mark off sections of a piece that's in sonata form or in a large music drama. And he's saying, okay, we lost that. What do we do? How do we build large scale pieces? Well, he's saying, oh, here it is. It took me 12 years, but I created, here it is. Method of composing with 12 tones which are related only with one another. That's one of the longest titles for a method I've ever heard of. But what does that mean? Well, it's a method for composing with 12 tones. What does 12 tones mean? He means 12 pitch classes. And you remember that the differentiation between pitch class and pitch that we should keep in mind always, of course, the piano has 88 pitches, but only 12 pitch classes, right? Those are all in the same pitch class. Okay, so that's what he means by 12 tones, which are related only with one another. What does that mean? Well, that means that they don't have any special relationships according to a hierarchy, such as tonality. Of course, in tonality, let's say we have C major. Well, the tonic is the most important, and then the dominant is next, and then it's a toss-up who's after that, maybe the leading tone. But all of those 7 tones, and even the chromatic tones, have a different relationship to one another depending on what key we're in. Well, he's saying they're only related to one another. They have individual relationships not governed by any hierarchy. One might imagine, the difference between, let's say, a family where the father and the mother have certain relationships to their children, etc. Well, there's none of that. This is all No a priori relationships between pitch classes. Okay, here's where he describes what it is. This method consists primarily of the constant and exclusive use of a set of 12 different tones. Now, he uses the word set. However, that's not strictly correct according to, traditional mathematical terminology. A set is an unordered collection of objects or numbers or whatever. It could be anything. But we're not talking about a set because the set that we're using is the set of all 12 pitch classes. And every 12-tone row uses all 12 pitch classes. What we're talking about is a series, a 12-tone series, okay? So you probably remember from math learning about the Fibonacci series or sequence, or so that's in an order. Anyway, the difference is a set is not ordered and a series is ordered. Now he says it is in no way identical to the chromatic scale. Here is a set, and he talks here. This little illustration gives us almost everything we need to know. I don't remember what piece is this. This may be for the piano suite that Glenn Gould was talking about. I don't remember. But the basic set, the BS, that's an unfortunate acronym there. But now, the way this is presented, it doesn't matter which octave these notes are in. It doesn't make any difference because a 12-tone series is a collection of pitch classes, not pitches. Okay, but what's interesting here is we have the basic set. We would call this the prime. And then this is an inversion. Now you'll notice that the inversion takes this 12-tone row or sequence series. They all mean the same thing, row, sequence, series, an ordered collection of objects. And the intervals are reversed, are made upside down. So instead of going up one semitone, we go down one semitone. Tritone is going to be the same. Okay, this one goes down 2 semitones. This one goes up 2 semitones. I can even play it for you so you can kind of hear. Here, I'll put this one an octave up and up. You can kind of see their mirror images of each other. Okay, so that's inversion. And these are two permutations of a 12-tone row. We're going to talk a lot about this, so don't worry too much. It'll become clear. Two of the permutations, the prime and the inversion. The P, get rid of the BS and put a P there, and then the I. There are two other permutations. There's a total of 4 permutations. The next one is the R, or the retrograde, and that consists of starting from the end and going from the beginning. So the retrograde would be C, B, G sharp, F sharp, F, etc. Very simple. And then the 4th permutation, maybe you can guess it, that's the retrograde of the inversion. So we would start at the end of the inversion. A, B flat, D flat, E flat, E, D, G sharp, F sharp, etc. Okay, so those are 4 permutations. We want to keep this terminology straight. Then each of those permutations has 12 unique transpositions. Okay, and that gives us a total of 48 row forms. Okay, 4 permutations, 48 row forms. If you can remember those ideas, those are going to be important. People get the terminology mixed up, but for our class, these are going to be our terms. 4 permutations, prime, inversion, retrograde, retrograde of the inversion, or P-I-R-R-I. and then 12 transpositions of each one for 48. And the way we notate them, we select a pitch class, one of the 12 pitch classes, to be 0. That could be any of them. It could be C. So a lot of theorists like to just use C all the time, but we don't have to do that. And then we put a subscript, or it doesn't have to be a subscript, but a number next to the PI, R, or RI, representing the transposition. So let's say here's our basic set starting on A, B flat, etc. Well, let's say I transpose this as a P0, and we'll make A our 0. If we started from B flat and we did all the transpose this whole thing up one semitone, B flat, B, F, E flat, E, etc., that's going to be called P1. Okay, so it goes P0, P1, P2, P3, etc. Okay, now that means that this one starts on, the inversions are also identified by their first note, their first order number. If A is 0, then C is going to be, A is 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3. C is going to be 3. So this is actually I3. Now, if I took this, so that's I3. If I were to transpose it down by one semitone, etc., B, B flat, E, F sharp, F, etc., that would be I2 instead of I3. Okay, let's go on. We're going to do so much with this. You'll get it. Let's rotate a little bit. Okay. Let's see. Okay, what are we talking about here? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so he's kind of giving the rules here. And we'll go through these a little more clearly. The series may be divided or subdivided into smaller groups of related motives, and any group may be joined to any other to form new combinations. Free tones, those that do not belong to the strict sequence of the series, may be interpolated between tones of the series or between groups composing it. Well, that adds a lot of freedom. Now, I will say Schoenberg and Berg used free tones, split up the series into little units that they would repeat. Webern did not do this. Webern was very enamored with the strictness, or at least the possibility of using this method in a strict way, and so he tended to not use any of these, kind of free aspects of the method. Okay, so blah, blah, blah. Here we go. Remember oh, I'm sorry. This is actually by Adolf Ice, who was I believe, a student of Schoenberg's. And here are some little quotes. These are good. Okay. Here, the main purpose of the 12-tone composition is production of coherence. He called that comprehensibility before, through the use of a unifying succession of tones, which have functioned at least like a motive. Thus, the organizational efficiency of tonal harmony should be replaced. So, again, in the absence of this very useful device of harmony, the 12-tone method comes in and kind of substitutes for some of the functions of harmony, tonal harmony, and it functions like a motive. And then he says, the main purpose of the row is to unify the motivic material and to enhance the logic of simultaneously sounding tones. Again, this idea of unity and logic, which, again, I come back to like the Impressionist composers, who maybe this idea of having logical music or music that expresses an idea is not so much of a priority. Behind the term logical there is for me a complex that says logic equals human thinking, equals human world, equals human music, equals human ideas of nature, and so on and so forth. Well, here he's trying to humanize. I'm sure he got criticized for saying music has to be logical, and then he's a little bit defensive. And then he's talking about note counting analyses. These are called 12 counts, and we will do a little of this. He basically says 12 counting does not tell us a ton about a piece of music. Again, it's pre-composition. It's a way of creating somewhat of a landscape. But then once having done that, Schoenberg basically says that he uses a lot of the properties of tonal music. Music that has melody, harmony, counter melodies, counterpoint, themes. He wrote pieces in sonata form and in all the major forms of the Austro-German tonal tradition. So, and this is again very different from Weber and even Berg, to be honest. So he's trying to say, look, the 12-tone series is not a theme. It's it's like a method. Okay, now this is a good place to go next. This is a little one-page, like a cheat sheet, that I think pretty much covers everything, at least in terms of the method itself and its rules and principles. So let's go over this quickly. This is going to be a review, but we just keep going over this over and over again. 12-tone series, again, set in quotes because it's not really a set, but that term is used incorrectly sometimes. There are 4 ways of varying any row, 4 permutations. The original version of the prime, and again, this has to contain all 12 pitch classes, and it may not repeat any of those pitch classes. The backwards version, going from end to beginning, the retrograde. The upside down version, interval direction from note to note, is reversed, and the backwards version of the upside down version or the retrograding version. Now, I will say, I mentioned to you that we identify, well, here, we'll talk about this. In addition, there will be 12 transpositions of each of these permutations, making a total of 48 possible versions of any 12-tone series. Each row form is identified by the permutation, P, R, I, and its transposition or starting pitch, which is represented by a subscript number. The starting pitch of P0 gives us the pitch class represented by 0, which can be any of the 12 pitch classes. So if the first pitch class is D, P0 is D, then E flat is 1, E is 2, etc. From that, we get the transpositions number for the other row forms. Now, this is important here. I hope it wasn't confusing up here, but the subscript number, and look, I didn't use subscripts here, whatever. The number that comes after P, I, R, or RI, that number gives the first pitch class for P and I, for prime and inversion. However, the subscript number for R and RI gives us the final pitch class of those row forms. Okay, so that's the difference in terms of counting. This will become more clear as we go on. In 12-tone music, there are a few basic rules that have generally been followed. Now, these have been stated in much more wordy ways. I think this is a pretty straightforward way of mentioning these. Now, I should mention the only composer I know of who's followed these almost completely strictly would be Weber. Schoenberg and Berg and many other composers break these rules. But for your pieces, for your composition, I want you to follow these because you should experience that. Okay, number 1, at any given moment, there can be one or more row form occurring simultaneously. And each row form may jump from voice to voice or instrument to instrument at any time. And again, we'll see lots of examples of this. So sometimes there's this term first order serialism, which is a kind of serialism in which there is only one row form happening at a given time. We'll look at a piece like that. That's rare. And then second order serialism is definitely the most common, where you have more than one row form at a time. Rule number 2, the order of the row forms should be maintained in the attack points of pitch classes. In other words, sustained pitch classes may overlap. So let's say we have a row form that goes from, C, D flat, E flat. Well, we could have, and of course these can be in any octave, but C, D flat, E flat. Well, it could go Now you'll notice I kept sustaining the C. It doesn't matter. Once you've attacked that, you've already covered that pitch class. You're free to move to the next next pitch class in the row form. Okay, or sorry, or etc. Okay, however, any number of sequential pitch classes in a row may be attacked simultaneously, i.e. a chord. So again, if I had C, D flat, E flat, I could have, C, D flat, E flat, or I could have C, E flat, D flat, or C. Those are all allowed. When things are attacked simultaneously, it doesn't matter the octave placement or the order in the chord. So, the most extreme version of that is you could have a 12 pitch class chord with all chromatic pitch classes attacked at once. You could do that, and that could be any of the row forms of any pitch, any 12-tone series. Okay, so chords, doesn't matter which member of the series is higher or lower once they're attacked simultaneously. Okay, any segment of the row may be repeated. So let's say, again, I have this C, D flat, E flat. If that were part of a row form, I could even do an ostinato, and then maybe once you've used that, you can repeat it. However, if you do that, or you could have something like that, the segment should have the same order. So I can't go, that's not allowed. And the other thing is, once I've done this, I have to stay in the octave that I first played them. I can't go, that's not allowed. A lot of this method is avoiding octaves. Octaves are kind of the enemy in 12-tone serialism. Excuse me. Okay. Now, that's it. Those are the 4 rules. That's the method of composing with tones that are related only to one another. Create a 12-tone row, and then you can use those 4 permutations, 12 transpositions of each permutation, and then follow these basic order rules. Okay, then I've given you a page. Again, I made this one up. Dr. Hicks is using it in his packet, which is great. I've given you some kind of interesting 12-tone rows, just to show you how composers have had fun with this, have used the construction of the 12-tone row as its own aesthetic exercise. And then that's like, again, kind of liberating. It's a starting point for composition. Again, I mentioned earlier on about pre-composition. Okay, the Berg Violin Concerto, very important, influential piece. Here's the 12-tone row. So, and usually I ask students to tell me what might be the paradigm that organizes each of these rows, but you're not able to do that. So I'll just talk about it. Well, Berg was an interesting composer. He was not altogether convinced of the idea of atonality. He loved to kind of, have an ambiguous halo of tonality sort of floating in the background of atonality. I don't know if that metaphor works, but you'll notice that this is made up of thirds, so we definitely have all these triads. Most prominently, we start with this G minor chord, and then this D major, or even and then we have others, A minor here, and E major. So it's like tonic and dominant chords built in. The tour de force is at the end of this violin concerto. Berg embeds a Bach chorale in the structure of the music, and I'm pretty sure using the 12-tone method. It kind of works with the 12-tone method, facilitated by this interesting, unusual 12-tone roll. Then here's another Berg 12-tone roll from the lyric Suite. You can see that it's made up of 2 hexachords. I should have put a line there. Each of which is very much of a diatonic hexachord. So we're only missing the B, and then so this is the remaining hexachord. One thing you'll notice that with 12-tone rows, the 2 hexachords, the 2 halves, are always going to be complements to one another. So another diatonic hexachord that's a transposition of this one, although order-wise they're different. Okay, no, Luigi no. Here's a really straightforward one. Sorry. I mean, this one seems so extreme. It's kind of like, wait, how are you going to make music out of that? If you have to stick to that 12-tone roll, every single melody, every single thing is going to have this wedge shape to it. Well, Nono's music proceeds very slowly. He loved to have slow and gradually unfolding music and pitch material. So it's actually quite beautiful and ethereal. It's a really fun, interesting shape. The Webern Concerto Opus 24. Is that the Webern? I think it is. Well, anyway, this is a classical example of a derived roll. We're going to talk about this, but the idea here is that each of these trichords, we could divide any 12-tone row into 4 trichords, comes from the same set class, the 0, 1, 2. And that's basically a derived row. The Symphony Opus 21, which we'll spend a lot of time with, this one's interesting in that the second hexachord is the retrograde of the first hexachord transposed by a tritone. So you'll notice that if we were, we have this first hexachord, A, F sharp, G, G sharp, E, F. So, down a minor third, up a minor second. If we start from the end and go to the beginning, we have the same thing transposed up a tritone and backwards. So it's really a really cool kind of symmetry. One of the effects of this is that, this is kind of cool, the R6, or this entire 12-tone row, transposed by a tritone, 6 semitones, and reversed, retrograded, is the same as the P. 0. Anyway, we're going to spend some time on that, so don't worry too much. This is another derived row, the 0, 1, 4. Each one of these trichords is a 0, 1, 4. This one has to do with hexachordal combinatoriality, which I don't think we're going to get to this semester. I know you're really bummed out that we're going to skip a somewhat difficult part of this subject, but you may study it in grad school. We'll see. And then finally, this piece by a minor theory teacher / composer, one of maybe two pieces that I've written using the 12-tone method. Kind of a bluesy sequential. Well, this is even simpler than the Webern Symphony. The second hexachord is also transpositioned by a tritone, but it's not retrograded. And then it's literally a tritone higher. Okay, well, I think that's enough for today. The next lecture we'll get more into the nuts and bolts. See you later.